Welcome to Airborne on staugustine.com. We're here in the Eclipse Recording Company studios with State Representative William Proctor. Dr. Proctor, welcome.
Matt, good to be back.
It's always
nice
good
to see you.
It's always good to have you, sir, and back in here. There's a lot of important things going on in Tallahassee, and we always appreciate you coming down and sharing with our viewers all that's going on. Some of the things that are the foremost in our minds these days are the economic outlook. Do you care to share with us a little bit about what you've learned?
Well, I think I've learned just how severely Florida has been affected by it. We are among 10 states that are designated as having been most severely affected. Obviously, that relates in a large measure to our reliance on housing and real estate is one of the major pillars of our economy. And of course, that's been one of the most severely affected. So we've had a difficult time. We have over 1 million people still unemployed, and we still have the second highest foreclosure rate in the nation. So the economy, while our revenue is improving and increasing, for example, this next year we should have maybe $1.9 billion more new revenue. Our expenses are going up at $4.6 billion. So we still have right now about somewhere between, you could say, $923 million and $3.6 billion, depending on what programs you think it's mandatory to fund.
Now, you mentioned mandatory funding. I know we like to prioritize and to categorize, and we mentioned things like critical needs versus important needs. Can you give us a sense of what we're talking about with this funding dilemma? What are some of the things that are critical versus things that are very important?
Well, you've got things that we might designate as entitlements.
Right.
Medicaid has a number of entitlements in it. There are welfare programs that have certain entitlements. Certainly the education funding at the K through 12 level, it's really an entitlement. It's got to be funded, and we know it must be funded. Public safety, corrections. So if you take human services, which is welfare and healthcare, that's 39% of our budget. If you take education, that's 32% of our budget. If you add in public safety, that's 8%. So you can do the numbers and realize that there's not a lot of money left for all the other functions of government.
That is critical. What about education funding? Again, you have a broad background in this area. What do you see?
Interestingly, at this point, Matt, I'm chairing the House Appropriations Committee for state universities, community colleges, private colleges, financial aid programs. And I know that we are going to be hard hit, frankly, in order to support the FEFP. Now, the FEFP is our public school funding formula. And I can assure you that funding the public schools is a high priority. Economic recovery, trying to provide jobs any way and every way we can. Economic recovery, funding the public schools, and in some way reforming Medicaid have got to be three of our top priorities, if not our top three priorities for this legislative session.
We're not the only ones in this boat, right? Now, I mean, nationally, there's a budget state fall as well, isn't there?
Of $180 billion estimated of aggregate state shortfalls.
Good gracious. We throw those numbers around so casual these days, don't we?
Yes. But they're not that casual when you start trying to balance them.
Start counting those zeros.
Right.
One of the things that is affecting us deeply as well, we're hard hit in our employment.
Very much.
Tell us about that.
Well, you know, as I say, we've got over 1 million unemployed. But when you're doing those numbers, you have to be very careful because you don't know how many people have simply quit looking. You don't know how many people are surviving on part-time jobs. You don't know what the real numbers are.
Right.
But if you're unemployed, the rate's 100%.
That's right.
And that's what you've got to keep in mind. For the person that's unemployed, that rate is 100%.
Good gracious.
And so, as I say, economic recovery and provision of jobs, but that's going to be a long-term proposition. Every report I've seen, every analysis I've seen, says that Florida's recovery is going to be a gradual recovery. And our revenue glide path, our improving revenue, simply doesn't match with our mandatory expenditures. So we've got a gap there.
Mm-hmm.
And a large measure of that gap is Medicaid. So when you start looking at it and saying, how do we get this under control? How do we present a balanced budget, which the Constitution requires? You have to come to grips with Medicaid.
It sounds like we're on a collision course with funding Medicaid.
Well, I've sat in on two meetings on it, extensive meetings. I don't see an alternative. If somebody knows one, I'm certainly receptive to it.
Mm-hmm.
But when Medicaid is going up, it's out of balance right now by $1.8 billion.
Good gracious. And all of this is compounded again. Unemployment, but well, we're also, our foreclosure rate, are we the second in the nation?
Second in the nation. The last report I saw, we're second in the nation.
And our district is, how do we fare?
Our district, of course, we've all been hurt.
Right.
There's no question about that. Clay, St. John's to some degree, but the area of District 20 that's been most severely affected is Flagler County. Flagler County has a 14% unemployment rate.
Mm.
So Flagler County has a real need to try to get some form of economic stimulation in there. I was down in Flagler County, Bunnell, yesterday afternoon, meeting at some length with the city fathers there for Bunnell.
Mm-hmm.
Some of your small towns, your small districts, people don't realize how severely they are affected because a few jobs lost is major.
Right.
In those communities.
It affects so many people, it kind of rolls downhill, doesn't it? I mean, a single job loss can affect so many people.
So many people.
Indirectly. The taxable value for schools, that's in decline as well, is that correct?
That's in decline as well. We've lost, I think the last number I saw was 9.5% decline in property value, taxable property value for school support. So when you start looking at the state budget gap, you've got that adds up to last, I believe, was $408 million. So that's just, when you add that to the Medicaid, $1.8 billion, and then you realize that there are other areas of critical public service, state service, that have to be funded. You get up to 2.6 to 3 billion very quickly.
That is, again, we throw these numbers casually these days when we're talking about a serious amount of difference here in what we're able to fund. This doesn't even get into something you and I have discussed on the radio for years now, and that is the hurricane season and the.
Well, we've been spared. We've had 4 or 5 years of no storms of any consequence.
I think you described it as a grace period.
It has been a grace period.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in those 4 or 5 years, rather than building surplus, whether we're talking about the state program Citizens,
right,
or whether we're talking about the private companies,
mm-hmm,
rather than charging actuarially sound rates,
mm-hmm,
which people don't want to pay, I understand that.
Right.
I have to pay them.
Right.
But whether we're speaking of either state program or the private companies, we haven't accumulated the surplus we need to accumulate. So if we have the 1 in 100-year storm, the estimate damage is $80 billion, residential and commercial. Citizens doesn't have the money to pay those kind of claims. The Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund doesn't have the money. Now you can look at it a couple of ways, but either way, we could probably come up as much as from $12 to $16 billion short of claims that we can't pay.
mm-hmm.
So people say, well, bond, but we've already done the bonding to provide for the money for the CAT fund.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no more bonding to be done. So that means we could have houses without roofs, we could have houses that can't be rebuilt, and there's no money. Now, we can start levying assessments, which the state will do,
Right.
which is one of my strong objections to our present policy. But nobody knows that assessment can only be collected over time. So if you've exhausted your bonding capacity, you have assessments, but they don't give you the cash to meet the demand that could result from the 1 in 100-year storm. Sorry.
That grace period that we, I hate to use the word squandered, but it's gone now, and again, we always wonder when the next one is coming every time the hurricane season rolls around. And you heralded this 5-6 years ago. I remember you telling us, Citizens isn't...
And I hope I'm proven wrong. I hope we go 15 years and never have the storm.
Yes, sir.
And all my alarming or crying wolf may be for naught. But if you have the North Storm next fall, we could be out of money. If you have 2 storms, we could be bankrupt. So that's the serious situation.
Precisely.
And we need to deal with it and be honest with the public about what the situation is, what the danger is, and what it could do to the state's economy.
It's something that it would mean higher rates for everyone, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
But it's sort of a pay me now, pay me later proposition, isn't it?
There's 3 things. There's 3 basic facts. And regardless how you feel about them, they're still facts.
Yeah.
One is we're a hurricane-prone state. There's no changing that. 2, we have built up our coastline to where it's the most expensive in the nation, over $2 trillion of coastal buildup. 3, you cannot control the price of reinsurance. Most of it comes from offshore. Now, when you have those 3 facts, you cannot really expect to have cheap and reliable property insurance. It flies against logic. It's always good, Matt. I always enjoy it.
My pleasure,
You do a great interview.
Oh, well, thank you. You make it easy for me. And what face us all by coming back to our district and getting the information out.
I appreciate the opportunity. Next time I'll cut the cell phone off.
We'll take care of that. William Proctor, thank you again with joining us on Airborne. Folks, stay tuned always on Airborne on staugustine.com, bringing interesting people from your world so you can stay dialed into your community and the folks who make it tick. Thanks again.
Hey, it's always good, Matt. I always enjoy it.
My pleasure, yeah.
You do a great interview.
Oh, well, thank you. You made it easy.